right. Good afternoon. Okay. I'm being told to hurry it up. My name is Caroline Durlacher, and I'm a graduate student in German literature and culture at UC Berkeley. And I have the honor of introducing the next panel, Elemental Readings. Our conference is called Reading Matters, and this panel is explicitly about expanding our sense of reading, as I think many of the panels will be. But who or what can read, what or who can be read, what plurality of unfinished entities are involved in whatever kinds of encounter can be called reading, what are the ethics of this encounter. We have the pleasure of hearing two talks on this subject from distinguished panelists, Professor Eduardo Cadava of Princeton University and Professor Stefan Helmreich of MIT. If Professor Cadava is a scholar in the humanities and Professor Helmreich is an anthropologist, both have long been pushing disciplinary boundaries in their thinking about the interactions of a technology, history, and materiality, and reading. Professor Eduardo Cadava is professor of English at Princeton University, but is also associated with the Department of Comparative Literature, the School of Architecture, and the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. His work, including Emerson and the Climate of History and Words of Light, Theses on the Photography of History, and much recent writing on the photography of Susan Meiselas, closely attends to the circulation and transformation of images in the process of history. His work asks what it might mean to read images historically when history does not mean a succession of dates and events in a linear continuum to be reconstructed from an image that represents it. Professor Cadava's work reestablishes connections between images, texts, and even buildings with material histories of war, race and slavery, human rights and citizenship, and the possibilities of democracy. Our second panelist is Professor Stefan, German studies background, Stefan Helmreich, maybe I'm, it's all good, all right, who teaches anthropology at MIT. Both his first book, Silicon Second Nature, Culturing Artificial Life in a Digital World, and his second, Alien Ocean, Anthropological Voyages in Microbial Seas, take up questions of the definition of life, nature, artifice, and intellectual and other kinds of property as they arise ever more urgently in the technologized practices and theorizations of a range of contemporary scientific communities. Alien Ocean, which won numerous awards, including the Gregory Bateson Book Prize from the Society for Cultural Anthropology and the Rachel Carson Book Prize from the Society for Social Studies of Science, attends to mutual meaning-making operations that take place among a group of marine biologists and the microbes which are the objects of their study, or are they? If Professor Cadava will be attending to photography as the writing of light, you might say that Professor Helmreich will be considering oceanography as the writing of the ocean. I very much look forward to a meaningful exchange that unsettles the borders of elements and media, processes of knowledge and objects of knowledge, scenes of learning and of transformation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cadava and Professor Helmreich.
Okay, thanks for being here. After this morning's panel, which was really fantastic, I think we're going to return to the more formal, traditional, and partly because of me. I was very absent the last few weeks, and Stefan and I didn't really have a chance to talk. But I was thinking, because I was, titles are always promises, so my subtitle has Desert, Seas, and Bodies. And as I was preparing the talk, I realized that I didn't really have time to talk about seas, so it's going to be deserts and bodies. But the sea section was going to be partly a nod in the direction of Stefan's amazing work on waves, and it was going to focus on a couple of passages, which I'll just cite to you now, just so you have them. This is the missing section of the talk, and then it'll be about deserts. I'll reference bodies of water, lakes, rivers, but not seas. What I was going to do in the middle section after the desert was talk about these two passages. One was from George Jackson, Black Panther, founder of the People's Army, who at a certain point in a letter to Angela Davis that he writes when he's in Soledad prison, referencing the middle passage, he says, my recall is nearly perfect. Time has faded nothing. I remember the very first kidnap. I've lived in the passage, died in the passage, lain in the unmarked shallow graves, the millions of corpses that fertilize the American soil, cotton and corn growing out of my chest unto the third, the fourth, the 10th, the 100th generation. And this passage one can put in conjunction or in relation to this extraordinary passage in Emerson's essay, Fate, where he's talking about how 1,000 ages go by and there's a layer of marl, 1,000 ages, a layer of limestone, 1,000 ages, a layer of coal, 1,000 ages, man appears. So this rhetoric of natural development leading to the emergence of man. And then he says, England, France, and Australia plant themselves on America. So the rhetoric of colonization gets linked to the rhetoric of natural development, which of course is part of the rhetoric that often justified colonization. And then Emerson starts citing Robert Knox, who wrote this book, The Races of Men, kind of racist text. And then after saying that this book has many pungent truths in it, he then closes the passage with this series of sentences where he says, the German and Irish millions, like the Negro, have a great deal of guano in their destiny. They're freighted across the Atlantic, carted across America, to ditch and to drudge, to make corn cheap, and then to die prematurely to make a spot of green grass on the prairie. It was an amazing passage about the way in which America is flourishing, or the fertilizer that ethnic minorities have become. Okay? There's a lot to talk about that, where you're getting the seeds from Britain, you're getting the guano from Africa, Latin America, you're putting this into the soil, the people who are harvesting the guano, mostly Chinese coolies, Peruvian convicts, etc., often die in the guano fields. They become part of the fertilizer along with carcasses of seabirds and sea lions. So all that gets put into the soil. Crops are born. Americans eat the crops. It's a very easy way to show that the American body is not strictly speaking American and not even strictly speaking human. Okay? That's the missing part. Okay, now I'm going to start. I'm starting with this passage from the Palestinian poet, Mahmoud Darwish, as he thinks about what it might mean to read the difference between bodies buried in cities and bodies buried in deserts. In a prose poem entitled The Humor of Eternity, included in his book A River Dies of Thirst, Darwish suggests that only photography has the chance of keeping the memory of the dead and the dispossessed alive, and in particular of training history to read in general. The poem even suggests that the act of memorialization is itself a training manual for reading, and for reading images in particular. Putting lost graves, photographs, and history in relation to one another, Darwish writes, graveyards have the dignity of air, the authority of dust. You say farewell to your friend Mamdou and wait your turn. The smell of wilting flowers and the rustling of trees transport you far away to the place that lies beyond matter, to your final address in some part of nothingness. But you are thinking of something simpler. Graves are mattresses. They seem like comfortable places to sleep. An occupant of such a grave would not lie staring up at his earthy sky, and like his counterpart in the graveyard near the Place de Trocadero in Paris, would be part of everyday life, being so close to cafes, museums, and the social play of the living. Life is within reach of his marble headstone, and the abundance of flowers, trees, birds, and people surrounding him makes it unnecessary for him to go out for walks, after he has spent his life savings on procuring the privacy of this permanent address. There are some graves that make absence into visible matter, like those broken down graves in the desert, far from trees and water. There is no friend for the sleeper who burns in the heat of the summer and freezes from the cold in the winter, as if death continues without end, since death is freed from the metaphor of sleep. But those who oversee the construction of their graves, furnishing them with their photographs, do not think about the comfort to be had from sleeping in friendly proximity to the living, but only of training history to read. They think also of something more complex, of bribing eternity, failing to understand that eternity does not visit graves and loves to joke." End quote. In a passage that oscillates between death and life, sleeping and waking, memory and forgetfulness, presence and absence, and eternity and transience, the narrator registers his finitude and mortality in the death of his friend. It is Mamdou's death that leads him to think of and even to anticipate his own death. This finitude is mirrored in nature herself as he signals her transience, with wilting flowers and the rustling of trees, in order to transport the living and the dead to their final resting place. But the dead buried in cities, close to cafes, museums, and the social interplay of the living, retain a relation to the living that enables us and them to imagine their death as simply a form of sleep. Surrounded by an abundance of flowers, trees, birds, and people, they seem to maintain a relation to life that prevents us from fully registering their death, their absence, and instead to imagine an ongoing relation with them, to think of their survival and even of ours. On the other hand, the now broken down graves in the desert, far from trees and water, make absence more visible and tangible, more impossible to overcome or neglect. They turn it into visible matter. Their isolation keeps their dead separate, visually and conceptually, from the lives of the living, and therefore prevents death from assuming the false metaphor of sleep. The dead in these broken down graves, in these shattered and fragmented memorials, stay closer to death than to life, and because of this run a greater risk of losing their relation to the living, of being forgotten, especially since the memorials that would remember them are no longer intact, but broken down in ruins. The authority of dust, we might say, has more force in the desert. This is why those who build the graves and furnish them with photographs of the dead do so not in order to pretend that the dead have an ongoing relation to the living. Neither they nor the dead are seduced by the metaphor that would associate death with sleep, but in order to train history to read. It is only when the dead body transitions from something that was once alive into being a thing that it can be legible, and not imagined as what it is not. It is only when we acknowledge that these bodies will not wake up and that they are not simply asleep that we can read them historically and without believing that we can bribe eternity in some way. At the same time, and this is what is so remarkable about this passage, both situations suggest the possibility that the dead can survive in memory, like a kind of ghost, that a relation between life and death, between the living and the dead, perhaps structures our relation to the past. What is at stake, though, is whether or not this past can survive in a meaningfully historical way, and the passage suggests the means of such a possibility would seem to be photography. Indeed, the passage suggests that photography does not simply identify the dead, prevent them from becoming anonymous, from being forgotten, but in doing so, it also becomes a means of training history to read. Photography helps record, document, preserve, and even present the traces of the past, and in a way that permits us to keep the memory of the past alive, even if it cannot be entirely reconstructed, and this because its traces are themselves finite and always in the process of vanishing. In this way, photography enables even the dead buried in desert graves to retain a relation to the living, even if only in the form of an embodied memory trace that can continue to circulate among the living. Like the ones who build the graves in the desert, Darwish places his words alongside the graves and the dead as markers on the ruins and traces of different memorial forms, and asks us to read these traces, the ones he produces and the ones he seeks to encrypt within the surface of his poem, as traces. Moreover, the link between photography and graves suggests that photographs seal within them, like a kind of grave, the traces of a body, subject, object, even an archive or network of relations. This is why every photograph presents the plurality of traces buried in its surface. Like the grave, the photograph is never simply an inert surface bearing a set of markings, a substratum meant to sustain them, to ensure their survival or subsistence. Instead, it also transforms what it seals within it. By placing photographs on the ruins and traces of the displaced and dispossessed, of the dead who will never awaken again, those who wish to memorialize the dead remind us that the photograph has always been associated with death, has always been structured around the absence of what it presumably represents, which is why death and mourning belong to the photographic experience. The photograph announces the death of the photographed. This is why what survives in a photograph is also the survival of the dead, what departs, desists, and withdraws. The conjunction of death and the photograph is in fact the very principle of photographic certitude. The photograph is a cemetery. Robert Smithson makes this point in his 1969 project, Incidents of Mere Travel in the Yucatan, when, presumably reporting what the Mayan god Tezcatlipoca, who as the god of light, mirrors, memory, and the sun, is himself another name for photography, had told him as they were traveling together through the Yucatan Peninsula. He writes, "The camera is a portable tomb. You must remember that," end quote. A small funerary monument, a paper graveyard, the photograph is a grave for the living dead. It tells their history, a history of ghosts and shadows, and it does so because it is this history. If we think of images instead of words, what Darwish says about the poet can be read as a description of the force of photography, since it too seeks to guard both the visible and the invisible, and through the power of the photographic image, to keep the voices of victims from being silenced entirely. What can a poet do before history's bulldozer but guard the spring and trees, visible and invisible by the old roads, and protect language from receding from metaphorical precision and from being emptied of the voices of victims calling for their share of tomorrow's memory on that land over which a struggle is being waged? A struggle for what lies beyond the power of weapons, the power of words, end quote. Darwish explores the relations between loss and survival, memory and forgetting, the past and the present, and the dead and the living. He evokes our relation to several deaths, including those produced by war, dispossession, displacement, and violence of all kinds, but also to the images and words, the photographs and texts that expose, record, archivize, work against, and sometimes conceal these histories. Considering the relations among memory, history, politics, death, and writing, this passage suggests that it is perhaps only through the experience of mourning that we can have an open and active relationship with history, with what passes, but also with what remains, and therefore also with the future. Darwish engages the stakes of photography and history by generating sites of memory in which the past is brought to bear on the present in order to articulate the conditions for a politics of mourning that also would be a politics of the future. In so doing, he suggests that this act of mourning is perhaps what gives us the right to read. In what follows, I wish to reinforce this claim for the relation between mourning and reading, bodies and history, and matter and memory, by turning to the photographic work of Susan Meiselas, and in particular to a diptych she produced in 1989 as part of a project entitled From Home to the Field. I trust that my reading of this diptych can itself suggest the protocols for what it might mean to read images and matter historically. The formal organizing principle of Susan's From Home to the Field series is this one. She decided that she would interrupt a roll of film wherever she was in it, and that she would not take another picture until she had traveled somewhere else. In this new place, she would take an image, and then she would form a diptych composed of the last image she took in the last place she had been, and the first image she took in her new context. Then she would try to think about what might link the two images, taken at different times and in different places, about what words might account for how these two images came to be alongside one another. If we can come to understand the visual and historical dynamics between these two images, we can perhaps begin to understand the way in which all images interact with one another whenever they are put next to one another, the way in which, never appearing alone, all images demand that we read them in relation to other images, and across the distance on the basis of which all relations are established. I want to turn to this diptych in order to draw some lessons from it about the activity of reading photographs in general, and of reading them historically in particular. Along the way, I hope to make some suggestions about the relation between photography and the bodies that are presumably referenced within them. The diptych in question is composed, first, of an image of Susan's family in upstate New York in the summer of 1989, and second, of the image she took on first arriving in Nicaragua some weeks later to work on Pictures from a Revolution. I should say that Pictures from a Revolution is a film that Susan makes 10 years after she had originally been in Nicaragua to document the Nicaraguan revolution. On arriving in Nicaragua some weeks later to work on Pictures from a Revolution, an image of a cross marking the very site on which she had 11 years earlier found what has come to be known as the Questo del Diploma torso, the torso of a rebel that she discovered on this Nicaraguan hillside. How is it that we can put these two images, these two worlds, into proximity with one another? The most direct answer would perhaps be to simply say, through photography. But to say this is just the beginning of a mystery, since the real question is, what is it in photography that permits us to put these so seemingly distant images alongside one another? And indeed, what happens when they find themselves next to one another? Well, there's perhaps something accidental about this juxtaposition. It is, of course, the result of a deliberate experiment, and therefore something closer to a planned accident. This is why we are invited to imagine the motivations behind this pairing, even if some of these motivations remain unconscious. What is perhaps first worth noting is that almost immediately after her arrival in Nicaragua, Susan returns to this entirely overdetermined site, at least in relation to her psychological, emotional, historical, and political investments. This can scarcely be an accident, since, as she has often noted, she is drawn like a magnet to sites of disappearance. That this second image evokes the photograph she took of the half-eaten torso of a rebel fighter on the same site in 1978 suggests that this diptych is at least a triptych that begins with this mutilated body on the hillside, and therefore unsettles the linearity that we would generally expect to exist between a before and an after. The first image of her family is taken before the second image in the diptych, but after her first encounter with this particular execution site in Nicaragua. To say that the photograph can circulate, that it raises questions about the relation between the past and the present, is perhaps not enough, however, and this is where we might register the real force of Susan's 2004 Reframing History project. This is a project where then, 25 years after she had gone to document the Nicaraguan Revolution, she returns and installs mural-sized photographs of the images she had taken in that place 25 years ago. There, this before and after structure is legible in the photograph's capacity to move from one context to another. What makes a photograph is perhaps its capacity to take on different forms, relentlessly and restlessly, to migrate, to travel, to move, often away from itself, and often in relation to different mediums. Indeed, within this frenzy of circulation, how can we even say what a photograph is? While it travels around the globe, it constantly redefines itself whenever it is recontextualized and reread. What happens when Susan returns to Nicaragua 25 years after taking the Questo del Diploma photograph, and in a kind of repatriation, reinstalls it as a mural-sized image in the same place in which it was taken? What spatial and temporal dynamics are at play when the photographic archive moves in different forms to the streets or the countryside and becomes exposed to the public beyond the walls of the institutional archive, the art gallery, and the museum? This process becomes a means of thinking about the relation between the past and the present, and in particular, a means of registering the changes that have occurred since the photograph was first taken. As is confirmed throughout the Reframing History project, the act of reintroducing the event or referent of the initial photograph into the context in which it was taken, even if decades later, functions as a kind of window onto both the past and the present, and onto a photograph's relation to the context in which it was produced. What is necessary is to trace the effects of installing this particular image in this particular site at this particular moment. And this even though a photograph can never have a fixed relation to either its provenance or its later iterations. The force of reinserting this particular image on the hillside in which Susan had found this half-eaten torso 25 years earlier, a well-known site of many assassinations near Managua that were carried out by the National Guard before and during the insurrection, has to do with the force of recalling a body in a landscape that no longer seems to remember it, and at a time when the government and the people also have forgotten much of what took place on this site so many years ago. If the National Guard disposed of the body here, it was because it wanted it to be seen as a warning and deterrent to other rebels. Taking the photograph in that context, in order to expose the violence of the government by recontextualizing the image within a counter-narrative, is very different than displaying it at another moment and in another historical political context. But in both instances, the aim is to keep this remnant of a body from being forgotten, to keep this singular death and everything it represents from being lost to history. If this reproduction of a lifeless torso is to speak, though, if it is to bear witness to the atrocities it underwent and that also served as part of the context that led to its destruction, if we are to begin to understand everything it represents, we need to reconstruct the history that is sealed within it and that is invisible within the frame of the image. This is why, as Benjamin explains in his 1931 Little History of Photography, in the long run it is the inscription or caption of a photograph that becomes its most important feature, since it is what helps tell us this history, since it can become the shifting register of the always changing significance of an image across time and space. In this regard, in a small text in which Susan discusses this image, she tells us that the image was never published in a magazine, and that instead she felt as if she had to make a book to hold this particular image as one of 71 photographs. That the whole book was made to contextualize that one image. Among so many other things, this suggests that we can only read an image by putting it in relation to other images, by surrounding it with other materials that together form part of the image's caption, part of the context within which it can be read. We can only read an image, that is, by reading it historically, but without ever imagining that we can fully saturate the context without which we could never even approach it. And this is because the image can never be entirely illuminated by its several contexts, because it simultaneously transforms them. Every image in Reframing History makes this indelibly clear, and I would add, this is why it is in photography, rather than in painting or other modes of representation, that the most fundamental questions in the last few decades about the limits of representation and the limits of the critique of representation have been raised. In order to press this point differently, and at the very limits of what can be represented, we could even say that it is this half-eaten body that is the real caption of her photograph, that becomes the secret alphabet that has to be read and given language that has to be transformed into words and sentences. But this means that the three images form a kind of ensemble, which would of course include many other related images, and perhaps minimally all the images she published in her book on Nicaragua, and that she has stated form the context for her earlier image, and therefore have to be read in relation to one another. What is at stake each time is a story about what the eye can see and what it cannot, about what the camera can capture and of what eludes it. To say this, however, is simply to say that our experience of the diptychs that compose From Home to the Field is always an experience of the eye, of an eye that seeks to see where it does not see, where it no longer sees, or where it does not yet see. But what is it that we see and cannot see in these images? If we look for visual rhymes across different shapes and forms and even tones and colors, we can begin to invent a story that might help us account for the relation between these images. We might start with the fact that the female figure with her arms outstretched, about to step into the pond, here serves as a kind of mediating form between the different photographs Susan took on the Questo Diploma, the first one in 1978 and the later one in 1989. In the movement from the Y of the torso to the T of the cross, the female body appears as both a Y and a T, and therefore marks the transition between this earlier and this later photograph, a transition that is signaled in the fact that she is about to step into water, which as a force of dissolution and transformation, perhaps anticipates and even facilitates her disappearance into the cross in the next image. There are several other formal elements to which we can pay attention as well, but I will only mention three here. First, there's a kind of visual echolalia between the shape of Lake Managua in the distance, in the image on the right of the diptych, and the shapes of the ripple circles around the two waterspouts that emerge from the pond. There is even a second circular shape in the plain below the cross in the Nicaragua image. Second, the lighter tone landscape in the area closest to the cross and extending into the plain, and the darker color of the hills in the upper left part of the photograph are a visual rhyme of the lighter color of the water closest to the woman and the darker tones of the water as it moves away from her, and especially in the upper left part of the photograph. Third, the frame of the diptych's first image includes a cut-off torso on its right edge, behind the standing woman, which references, at least in the context of my suggestion, that this image is haunted by its relation to the image that is to come, and to the one that precedes the diptych altogether, even if only obliquely and in a displaced fashion, the torso and arm in Susan's earlier image, a torso and arm that get reattached in the cross that simultaneously marks their absence. As a result of these relays, there are several exchanges or swaps that take place between the photographs. Water is exchanged for a landscape. A female figure is swapped for a cross. A cross has appeared in exchange for a body that is no longer present. A living fragment of a body appears as a substitute for a half-eaten torso. Circular bodies of water seem to cross the borders of a picture's frame. And given that rebels were disappeared on the hillside as well as along the shores of Lake Managua, a commemorative marker shares its work with a body of water that is both a grave and an always shifting activity of remembrance and forgetting. In addition, an image that presumably is more closely associated with a sense of home for Susan, since it includes a number of her family members, is exchanged for an image that is more distant from whatever she might call her home. But as a result of the exchanges that take place here, the presumed familiarity of this proximity to Susan's family is interrupted by the intervention of the image that follows it, and that introduces a darkness and death into the earlier image's more idyllic setting, in the same way that the torso she finds more than a decade earlier introduced death and disappearance into the beauty of the Nicaraguan landscape. To begin to formalize the lessons that can be drawn from this diptych, I would like to say that the fact that every detail here can potentially become exchanged for another one, and even more than one other one. For example, the female figure can become a cross, and then by association, the missing body to which the cross refers, suggests the continual distortions and displacements from which the photographic detail or subject emerges, but always as an other. This movement of disfiguration, linked to the chiasmic plurality of the image's interwoven figures, makes it impossible to isolate the images from each other. In this world, the essential difference between human and non-human, or between animate and inanimate, is annulled, with various elements and life forms becoming modalities of the same essence rather than discrete essences. This blending does not mean that phenomena lose their individuations. We can still tell a body from a cross, a lake from a valley. But they nevertheless become more porous, entangled in the same embodied transit that makes them what they are and what they are not. And this because where everything can become something else, for example, in the haunted space of photography, nothing is ever just itself. Because figures are always haunted by other figures, are always bearing the traces of the other. They are always themselves and not themselves at the same time. What gets signaled here is not only the structure of photography in general, a structure that names simultaneously the affirmation and loss of identity that attends the entry into a photographic space, but also a mode of creating images that performs at the level of its details what it wants us to understand, and achieves this whether it does so consciously or not. Indeed, that the two images that form this diptych belong together is confirmed not simply by the reading I'm offering here, a reading that wishing to demonstrate that the active reading what the active reading involves suggests that it always begins elsewhere, but also by a very beautiful series of sentences in which Susan discusses the moment in which she's making pictures of the revolution. The moment, of course, when she makes the second image of this diptych. In these sentences, she not only steps into a body of water, just like the woman who steps into the water in the diptych's first image, but she also registers the power of history to move her in directions she perhaps did not expect, to proceed without her, and because of this to introduce a sense of loss that perhaps leads her inevitably back to the site where so many years earlier she had taken the image of the Questo Diploma torso, since this site is linked to a history that she can clearly never leave behind and will always include her. In these sentences, she writes, "Embarking on the kind of journey I did through Nicaragua and El Salvador is a bit like stepping into a body of water, the depth of which is unknown until you take the plunge. There's the tension between how deep the water is and how far you're willing to explore. You can be overpowered by a current and lose your balance. I know there were times when I allowed myself to experience that. The pull of history is powerful. But at some point, one has to rebalance, recalibrate, get to the other side of the river. Pictures from a Revolution is the point where I pull myself out of the river. I'm on the bank at the other side. I'm looking at the end of the story, at least my part in it. It's going on without me, and there's a lot of sadness, end quote. What this diptych triptych tells us is that reading images historically involves reading them in relation to other images and histories, tracing in the one image the disfigured and transformed traces of the others. Each of these photographs becomes an event in the other ones, repeats itself in them, even as its repetitions are only the virtually infinite return of what is never the same. It is in the possibility of our being able to read these relations and differences that we can begin to register what we might mean by the historical dimension of images. This is why we must read an image in relation to what precedes and follows it, and why the task of reading historically demands that we not only trace the manner in which a photograph shares some of its elements with other photographs, how it is situated within a particular or general historical context, how it is inscribed in a series of images and relations, but also what remains idiomatic in the image, how it confirms this context even as it betrays it, distances itself from it in order to respect it. In order to further this point and to think more carefully about the relation between images and history, between images and matter, I wish to close with one more image taken by Susan in Nicaragua in 1979, an image that shows a father collecting the remains of his assassinated son, who has been identified by a shoe lying nearby. The remains of the son form another Y, with their outline left on the ground beside it, a kind of ghostly trace of the burnt cadaver the father has so lovingly tried to retrieve. The remains can scarcely remain together or intact, however, and are in a state of continuous deterioration. Already part of the son's remains have been left behind on the ground. The remains that are meant to reference and memorialize the body of the dead son, in other words, are in the process of disintegrating even further, and cannot any longer refer to the son's body, if they ever did. They are remains that do not remain. This is why, as Maurice Blanchot noted so movingly in his 1951 essay, Two Versions of the Imaginary, in which he famously identifies the image with the cadaver, what we call mortal remains escapes common categories. Something is there before us which is not really the living person, nor is it any reality at all. It is neither the same as the person who is alive, nor is it another person, nor is it anything else. If we view this photograph through the lens of this passage, we can conclude that the son's remains are neither present nor absent. They testify without testifying, because among so many other things, they testify to the destruction of memory itself. This is why we might say these remains can never correspond to that of which they are supposed to be the trace. I would even go so far as to say that in every trace and in every experience, there is this destruction, this experience of destruction, which is experience itself. And I would say the same for the photograph, since it too can never correspond with what is before the camera. There is always so much more in a photograph than what we can see on its surface, and at the same time, never enough, which is why Susan always feels compelled to supplement the image by surrounding it with other images and by trying to reconstruct all the histories that are encrypted within it. As Susan herself puts it, as she imagines a relation between excavating and taking pictures, and in particular, as she explains what might permit us to begin to make sense of these presumably different activities. In the same way that a collection of unearthed bones can reveal concealed events, these photographs cannot be denied. But like scattered bones, these images would have remained disconnected from the narrative skeleton without knowledge of the people and place from which they've come. Unquote. The photograph itself is never enough, since by itself it can never match what is inside it, and this because of everything that outside it and beyond its frame has left its traces on its surface. In this instance, too, the dead son, having become an image, even if a material one, the ashes to which the son has been reduced are themselves a trace, an image of him, just as the photograph Susan took is still an image of him, at least of him as he is now, or as he is not now, has become something that cannot be grasped. As Blanchot would put it, speaking of the cadaver itself, and of the cadaver as the thing to which the one who was once alive has been transformed. It is not the same thing at a distance, but the thing as distance, present in its absence, graspable because ungraspable, appearing as disappeared. It is the return of what does not come back. He who just died is at first extremely close to the condition of a thing. a familiar thing which we approach and handle, which does not hold us at a distance. But now he is dead. From behind there will no longer be an inanimate thing, but someone, the unbearable image and figure of the unique being, becoming nothing in particular. It is striking that at this very moment, when the cadaverous presence is the presence of the unknown before us, the mourned deceased begins to resemble himself. There will be a great deal to say about these passages, and I hope we might talk about them together. But what I wish to emphasize here is that, like the remains of a cadaver, every photograph is also the return of what does not come back. It is the trace, the visual repetition of something that, even at the very moment in which the photograph was taken, is already in the process of becoming something else. What Blanchot suggests is that we do not have to wait until we encounter a cadaver to know that we are always becoming someone or something else. But once we do encounter a cadaver, this truth becomes ineluctable. This is why he suggests we come to ourselves, we come to understand something about ourselves, as the ones who are never just ourselves, or at least not the same ourselves from one moment to the next, when we encounter a cadaver. Since it is there in this encounter that we come closest to the matter and mortality that we not only share, but that makes us who we are. It is in this encounter with death that we come to resemble ourselves as mortal and finite and mattered beings. It is because we are defined by our mortality and finitude that we are made and unmade by our images. This is why photography tells us we can always only love ruins, because we can always only love what is mortal, what is mattered. In this instance, this photograph of ruin, minimally the record of an incineration, of a dead sun, and of the body of the dead sun, suggests the ruin of the image's capacity to show, to represent, to address and evoke the persons, events, truths, histories, lives, and deaths to which it would refer. What makes the image an image is its capacity to bear the traces of what it cannot show, to go on in the face of this loss and ruin, to suggest and gesture toward its potential for speaking. I would link this statement to Susan's own insistence that a photograph is a document that resists erasure. Even as the trace of the sun's body continues to deteriorate, even when we take a lesson from it about our own finitude, it still remains as a vanishing trace. Indeed, even when an image tells us it can no longer show anything, when it reaches the limit of what it can show, it nevertheless still strives to show and bear witness to what history has sought to silence, like Susan's Questo Diploma torso, even if it needs innumerable other images and other stories to have its significance surface. In this context, this means at least two things: that the evidence provided by the photograph can never be understood solely in terms of its relation to the reality to which it presumably refers, since however referential we may think the photograph is, it can never be decisive or definitive on its own. And two, the evidentiary character of the photograph can never be entirely erased. It remains. These bodies were killed and left to rot. Documenting this is an irreplaceable and invaluable act, regardless of whether or not what is shown is denied, independently of whether or not people act on what is shown directly and decisively. If we say that a body is killed, however, perhaps the question that remains is what it means to say that a body is killed. Or rather, what is it that is killed when a body is killed? This would include all the relations and histories that had left their traces in this body and that enabled it to always be more than a body and less than one. This is why the images Susan produces have to be considered in terms of the broader context or narrative into which their testimony is situated and in relation to how they are presented and by whom. This means, as Tom Keenan has argued in an essay on Alan Sekula's writings on the ambiguous documentary character of photography, that by itself, the imprint of the trace decides nothing, settles nothing, determines nothing, forces no conclusions. Conclusions, decisions happen in an altogether different realm and depend on differing presentational circumstances and conditions of use. This indeterminacy of meaning does not hold in spite of the indexicality of the image, but because of it. Because there is a trace, an imprint, there is the possibility of interpretation, the opportunity for meaning, fiction, and hence the battleground of fictions. Because there is a trace, there is a battle. Around the image, a debate can begin. We decide what it says, it does not, it cannot. If the image of a father trying to retrieve the remains of his son's body suggests the incapacity of the photograph to coincide with the photographed, it also points to the inability of the photograph to remain on the side of evidence all by itself. In both instances, the referential character of the photographic trace is unsettled, even if for different but related reasons, and can only be restored by an interpretive struggle that itself has to be reinforced by, among other things, documents, interviews, testimonies, other photographs, and as would be the case in this instance, by forensic work that at least would seek to recover the traces of this body. But this gesture of making history with photographs begins in a very modest way, in the recognition of the capacity of a photograph to serve as a kind of memorial for the disappeared. There's a beautiful series of images in Susan's Kurdistan project in which photographs of the disappeared are worn in their memory. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful of them, an image of family members wearing the photographs of Peshmerga martyrs in the Saiwan Hills Cemetery in Arbil in northern Iraq. There's something very simple but very moving in this image, and I simply wish to leave it here, suspended, like a kind of pendant that rhymes with the images pinned but floating on the clothing of these mourning women. I would dare to say that everything I've wanted to say today is sealed and encrypted in this image. Everything is here, which is to say that everything is also not here, beyond its frame, even as we are invited, once again, to read all its present but invisible traces, traces that would reference, without referencing in a fixed and final way, all the worlds sealed within it. But this means that however difficult and even impossible it may seem to insist on memory, we must imagine a means of remembering what remains without remaining, what, even if it is destroyed and ruined, even if it is in transit or passing before us, still demands to be preserved, even if within a history that can never enter into history. This obligation delineates the stakes of what it might mean to read historically, and why we must learn to read the past, and more precisely, the irretrievable images of the past, in a way that, following Walter Benjamin, knows how these images threaten to disappear as long as we do not recognize ourselves in them. This is why, as the Italian artist Salvatore Puglia would have it, and as I've wanted to suggest with Darwish's poem and Susan's photographs, what remains for us is to collect the fleeting images of what has disappeared, to recollect the floating fragments of this history of disappearance. What remains is the possibility of a gesture, to hand, to hold out, in the scattered memories to which we are condemned, some vestigia, some expressions of a multiple anamnesis. This multiple anamnesis, this act of remembrance that begins in mourning, in trying to preserve what is always in the process of vanishing, is not only what enables reading, but also what requires it, even if it always has to begin again and again, forevermore. Thank you.
So this is another academic paper in the genre of the read spoken paper. It's a science studies paper, and I want to thank Daniela and Zuleika and Mari for the invitation and for all of the work that they've been doing to make this event unfold in the way it does. Reading waves. So this is, from photography to oceanography, as Caroline said. So it goes like this. In Italo Calvino's short story, Reading a Wave, the protagonist, Mr. Palomar, standing on a beach, seeks to follow with his eye the arrival, passage, and eventual decoalescence of a single ocean wave. He endeavors to, quote, carry out an inventory of all of the wave movements that are repeated with varying frequency within a given time interval, unquote. Calvino later explicated this tale as an inquiry into how to interpret the non-linguistic, how, as he put it, to, quote, read something that is not written, unquote. Mr. Palomar, however, already has plenty of hermeneutic tools at his disposal. He parses what he sees in terms of frequency and time interval, making his reading thoroughly sieved through a technical grammar that has its canonical expression in written equations. Insofar as Palomar's perceiving and decoding practices to take a phrase from Jennifer Gabrice and Helen Pritchard, are key to his attempts to arrive at a rhythmically attuned visual discernment. They are already formatted through a grid of interpretation. In what follows, I want to think with and against Calvino about waves, using the analytic of reading to interpret the material, semiotic, and political work of a technology created expressly to achieve what Mr. Palomar attempts. That technology is the wave buoy, an instrument deployed in ocean waters to measure and telemetrically report, often on the web, in formalisms like the one below, a spectrogram, wave heights, periods, and directions to regional and national weather services, companies that operate oil drilling platforms, networks of container ships, fishing boats, and surfers. Unlike Mr. Palomar, such devices are not imagined as seats of phenomenological or subjective experience, but as mere material recorders of measure, instruments that take readings rather than do readings, in the sense of offering informed exegeses. And yet, just as Mr. Palomar's apperceptions are saturated with the technoscientific, so too are buoys situated within worlds of human interpretive concern, a claim that I anchor in ethnographic fieldwork that I have conducted with ocean engineers in the Netherlands, in California, and elsewhere, part of a wider project I've been undertaking on the anthropology of wave science. But before I read buoys reading waves, I want to do a speed read of some allegorical apparitions of waves. If these days, for scientists, waves are figured as mathematical objects, like the one you see here in the lower left, that represents a departure, or does it, from earlier, particularly Western, Judeo-Christian, and colonial apprehensions of waves through myth and symbolism, figurations that have posed waves primarily as figures of wildness. So such folklore has sometimes pitched waves as seductive and dangerous sirens, luring male sailors to their deaths. The 9 Norse wave maidens, remixed as the Rhine maidens by Wagner, described in the Icelandic prose Edda from the 13th century, are a type specimen. Quote, "Who are those brides who go along in the surf skerries and have their journey along the fjord? Seldom are they gentle with the band of men, and they are awakened in the wind. They have pale hair, the white-hooded ones, and those women do not have husbands," unquote. Feminist sound theorist Tara Rogers, turning to Lusa Rigarai to show how, quote, "the physical properties of waves have been aligned with connotations of fluidity and excess associated with female bodies throughout Western history," unquote, argues that attempts to linearize and describe wave motion have participated in masculinist projects to objectify or give form to feminized flux, to which I would add that such flux itself can morph, modulating genders and crossing racializations, as here in a 19th century European image that represents the wave as an anonymous masculine russet-skinned figure calling to mind and assimilating to a dark nature the working-class bathers that often attended middle-class white European women at Victorian beaches. In other representations, waves transit the species boundary, appearing as animals, usually horses or dolphins. In still others, waves are primitivized, orientalized. Virginia Woolf, in a passage from The Waves that knowingly parodies rhetorics of colonial white fragility, offers an example, quote, "The waves drummed on the shore like turbaned warriors, like turbaned men with poisoned assegai, who whirling their arms on high advance upon the feeding flocks, the white sheep," unquote. In these readings, waves are coded as other to their human readers who represent them from outside as forces to be feared, tamed, or domesticated or dominated. And it would not be difficult to detect the objectifying inscriptive logic of which Tara Rogers writes in photos such as this, an image from 1938 of Scripps Institution of Oceanography scientist Eugene Lafond with his wave recorder, an apparatus that tracked ups and downs of a float in the water and recorded these oscillations on a scrolling piece of paper wrapped around a cylinder, thereby objectifying the processes. Or to find in this 1940s photo of Scripps oceanographer Willard Bascom measuring waves with a ruler, a kind of in the ocean but not of it, grappling toward what historians of science Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison might call mechanical objectivity, a mode of fixing the world through gridded representation. Or think of from the air God's eye views of waves that became current in World War II. Such readings of waves by oceanographers are, a la Mr. Palomar, delivered from outside or above. Today's scientifically scanned waves, however, are often measured in the sea itself, though not without framings that seek then to render these readings rational and mechanically objective. So let me return to the buoy, to a reading of the most popular wave buoy in the world, the directional wave, there is such a thing, the directional wave rider, manufactured since 1961 in the Netherlands by a company called Datawell. At a time when the ocean's properties are increasingly known remotely through satellites, buoys retain a kind of steampunk heft, cumbrous metal devices situated in the floating world of sea sensing, enmeshed in ever newer nets of sensors that quantify such qualities as temperature, salinity, currents, and acidity. Where might one locate oneself to read a wave rider reading waves? Watching a buoy bob up and down in the sea might enable a kind of seasick Mr. Palomar-style scansion. Physically deploying a wave rider might afford a sense of the thing's weight, its elastic moorings, the awkwardness of situating it in a sloshing medium. Accessing a data feed from a buoy through a dedicated screen receiver, a more remote digital lens might deliver a reading like this, formatted according to the the World Meteorological Organization's synoptic code for reporting wave buoy data. And looking at an internet display showing formatted information would offer the view that many professionals employ at national meteorological or Coast Guard or oil company desk jobs. Such readings might be superficial readings, taking the buoy's outputs at face value. But if reading is a practice tuned, as Daniela Gandorfer writes, to, quote, make sense, to link syntactical parts, grammar, concepts, inter- and hypertextual references, glosses, titles, structures, letters, paper or digital papers, and to move through, within, and beyond what we are used to understand as a text and as a frame, then there are many ways to make sense of the form of the buoy and the waves that it reads. So in what follows, I'll offer Marxist and new materialist readings, or additive readings, which rather than unpeeling layers of signification, place frame-shifting interpretations onto waves. I'll approach buoys and waves as entities that already wear their mediations on their sleeves, a kind of surface reading. And I'll look at the online data streams that buoys produce, which point toward a kind of big data-inspired distant reading. I'm interested in how such modes of reading redefine accounts of sensing practices, understood by Jennifer Gabrice and Helen Pritchard to fuse, quote, an assumed human-centered set of perceiving and decoding practices with those of extended entities, technologies, and environments of sense, like remote sensors, a definition that repositions sensing as parceled out across a range of entities. And I'll note that insofar as buoys themselves read waves, they do so through a mathematical idiom. Their measures filtered into a sign system that, as Brian Rotman has suggested, has no place for an experiencing, speaking subject. So unlike natural languages, the language of mathematics has no I, me, or us, or deictic pointers like here, now, and today. Conjoined human buoy readings of waves thus hybridize local embodied knowledge experience with situated practices of mechanical measure. And I'm inspired too in part by an analytic due to historians Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer, who in Leviathan and the Air Pump, and I picked this cover because the air pump kind of looks like a buoy on this one, suggest that Robert Boyle's circa 1660 mechanism for producing a vacuum, his air pump, could be understood through the material, literary, and social technologies that concretized, explained, and authorized it. I treat the Datawell wave rider as a material technology with literary informational tendrils out into the world, a world stitched together through a media ecology of instruments and social institutions. So, during anthropological fieldwork among wave scientists in the Netherlands, I visited the Datawell Wave Rider production facility in the hamlet of Herhuga Ward. Harry Paniquet, a sales representative, met me there and brought me to a modest clutch of modern office buildings and walked me through a facility with a look not of a massive production line, but of a small factory making use of craft labor. 3 Dutch women around middle age sat at desks next to large windows, chatting while they assembled circuit boards and set these on metal chassis that would eventually be inserted into buoys. These circuit boards, with parts manufactured somewhere else in the global assembly line, attached to transmission devices. Reading waves with buoys points, no surprise, to uneven political economies of labor and material sourcing. Paniquet ushered me into a laboratory to show me the interior plastic orb of a wave rider, a fishbowl-like globe that would eventually be cradled within the metal sphere of a buoy casing. Let's see, I have a little movie of it, but I don't know if this will work. It might not work. No. Anyway, it's these 2 kind of plastic orbs. There's one that's on the exterior, and there's one that you can't see on the interior because it's also transparent, and they kind of move around inside of one another like a gyroscope kind of thing. So the globe materializes a design in place since the 1960s, when Datawell began making these devices, a task for which the company was founded after the Dutch floods of 1953, which killed 1,800 people, and looms very large in the Dutch national history. The buoy has origins in the maritime concerns of a history preoccupied with those storm surge waves to which the Dutch coast is particularly vulnerable. This buoy is a kind of sentinel. At the center of the apparatus is an accelerometer, a sensor that tracks the changing speed of a thin sideways mounted platinum iridium rod that waves up and down inside of a plastic box filled with an electrically conductive liquid. The rod's waviness, generated by and acting as an interior scale model of the waviness of the ambient ocean, is tracked by 2 electrodes that measure electrical potential difference, or voltage. The oscillation then serves as a proxy for vertical acceleration, and therefore for wave height. But measures of wave height can only be properly extracted if the buoy can separate vertical acceleration from the pitch and yaw and roll of a randomly swaying buoy. Isolating up and down movement, the company's literature reports, was made possible by, quote, introducing a stabilized platform in here, serving as an artificial horizon on which the accelerometer is mounted, unquote. In other words, the buoy needs to bring the level of the world, the horizon, inside of into itself, into its innards. If, as Deleuze once wrote of surfing, quote, the form of entering into an existing wave no longer demands an origin as a starting point, but a sort of putting into orbit of the surfer, unquote, the buoy, borne up by orbiting water molecules, nonetheless retroactively simulates an originary stillness. So even before the buoy reads waves, it already has written into it a diagram of wave action. One of the key formalisms explicating water wave motion is the orbital. Water wave motion, initiated by wind, creates and then is perpetuated by the circular motion of water particles in orbits. In this scheme, a wave is a pattern, and as it moves forward, water molecules trace out circular motions. Think of this as a kind of non-human writing, though only legible because of human practices of graphic inscription. Properly to reproduce this inscriptive logic requires a design tuned to the physics of the sea surface, dependent upon precisely chosen fluids, plastics, and metals. The assemblage of accelerometer and disc-shaped horizon platform is nested near the equator of the plastic globe, with that globe then filled with liquid, enabling the apparatus to behave as though it is floating in the ambient seawater. This is made possible by ensuring that the interior liquid, which is a mix of distilled water and glycerin, and plastic have matching thermal expansion coefficients, so the submerged weight of the platform and the accelerometer is virtually nothing, so that the buoy, in other words, immersed in seawater, is not measuring itself, which would deliver a misreading. The central polystyrene sphere in which the accelerometer sits is itself held loosely within another sphere, which permits the inner sphere to stay still and the outer to move with the waves. So this permits the buoy to be in the sea but not of it, as well as to be in the sea and of it. So a vacillation perhaps between what Karen Barad discusses as the difference between the Cartesian cut, in which there's a clear line between subject and object, and an agential cut in which that's a contingent kind of accomplishment, right? So think of the buoy as a floating eyeball that can only read waves properly when it is filled with just the right mix of liquids. Or maybe not. The buoy's reading of waves is not really akin to Mr. Palomar's visual scan, but is, to make another analogy to organismic sensing, about touch and about proprioception, the sense of one's movement and position, the registration of the pressure and location of impinging phenomena. There's more. In the earliest manifestation of this double sphere, this double sphere was able to measure height, but not direction. The directional version added an accelerometer in the perpendicular direction, coupled with a compass, which adds to the buoy a kind of magnetoception, a sensory mode famously present, for example, in homing pigeons, the sense of the magnetic field. Filmmaker Harun Farokhi once named as operational images visual representations that didn't need to be viewed by humans in order to be handed along to computational interfaces. So think, for example, as Farokhi did, of missile targeting systems, images that never need to be seen by a person in order to work visually. The wave buoy, processing proprioceptive and magnetoceptive impressions, doesn't deliver operational images so much as operational impressions. And so, the material composition of the buoy matters at every level. The globes, the casing, the paint, the alkaline batteries, the rubber, the buoy as a kind of vibrant matter, situated in a sea of vibrant matter, is an amalgam of multiple materials under constant evaluation, pointing us to the political economies of extraction, labor, and chemical combination of the kind that Nicole Starosielski and Stacy Alimo have argued are central to ocean infrastructure like undersea cables. I'd read in the company's literature of the conditions to which the device had to adapt: seawater, pollution, which could eat into the stainless steel hull within half a year if it wasn't painted properly, a problem fixed by using copper nickel in the newest versions, ice cold, fish. The buoy could also become an ecosystem for marine creatures, in which case it would be subject to what they call biofouling, which is a kind of foul word, which could influence the accuracy of the transducers in the hull of the buoy. The solution to that was an anti-fouling paint on the transducers, a paint that as a biocide then demanded that data well wrangle with environmental regulation, which is a still in process task. Buoys sit in the kinds of bodies of water that Astrida Nimanis has examined as sites of chemical and toxic circulation. Waves are physical processes that happen in an organic ocean. That aliveness can jam the measurement of processes understood to be analytically separable as physics. Buoys read waves as formal structures and less as chemical heaves of swirling hydrogen oxide dosed with sodium, chloride, sulfate, magnesium, calcium, and potassium ions, aka seawater. Pennikeet then gave me a tour of the repair shop, which featured damaged buoys. Some had been run over by ships. Some had been used by fishers as moorings. Buoys from U.S. waters sometimes came back with bullet holes in them, a sign that people might be using them for target practice or seeking to disable them. Some looked like they'd been in the process of being taken apart for scrap metal, perhaps by pirates. If buoys are non-human organs for apprehending the ocean, these organs are bound into practices that point to processes other than the oceanographic. One might read buoys as signs of the politics of resistance, of appropriation, of resource inequality. What does a reading of the wave rider's reading of waves tell us about ocean sensing? That waves are known through machinic sensors that depend upon measurement instruments that, in harnessing the properties of metals, plastics, and calibrated liquids to capture aspects of the world, become amalgams of human and non-human sensing. waves are known through materials that hail from widely distributed and changing political economies of mining, platinum, iridium, copper, zinc, nickel, the manufacture of synthetic materials, polystyrene plastic, and plantation agriculture, rubber. Spooling an inventory of elements out from wave readings provides a snapshot of relations of resource access, regulation, and modification over the last 50 years of European industrial manufacture. So where do wave buoy readings go? Into a telecommunicative web that enlists radio transmitters, GPS devices, satellites, and the internet into relaying data to shoreside and ship recipients. Recall the coded wave reports sent from buoys, which may end up on a dedicated screens receiver. Following Chapin and Schaefer, this is a literary informational technology, operating as what they would call an objectifying resource, designating a scientific instrument rather than its creators as arbiters of the phenomenal world. Tracking the informational life of buoys reveals an aspiration for the tools to be transparent recorders, what Chapin, Schaefer, and Donna Haraway would call modest witnesses, sending communiques from the sea surface. How does such information arrive to users? The earliest wave riders sent out signals at a frequency of 27 megahertz. Not long after their introduction, however, radio readers of such transmissions would need to be mindful of other communities residing in the electromagnetosphere. Nowadays, in the DataWell Buoy Installation Guide, we learn that, quote, in case a transmitter is used within territorial waters, a radio permit from the local authorities is obligatory. And the transmitting frequency band 28 to 29.7 is reserved for amateur radio operators and needs to be avoided, unquote. The media ecology of the spectrum is densely settled. Buoys are part of media infrastructures that channel what Lisa Parks and Nicole Starosielski have called signal traffic. Signals from buoys have to fit into legal frameworks. In early days, the Dutch authority over national waterways was the same one as issued regional transmitting licenses, a convergence that made Dutch waters what DataWell called, quote, the great outdoor laboratory of our company, unquote. So dynamics from Dutch waters, assumed wind speeds, for example, became models for dynamics elsewhere. So the wave rider carries around with it wave models originally developed for one part of the world and that have to then be adjusted for dynamics elsewhere. The buoy can be read as a symptom of how ocean politics have been enabled by national infrastructures, with buoys looking like harmless bystanders even as they concretize real relations of territorial control in ocean space, reading here via what Ricoeur would have called a hermeneutics of suspicion. Anthropologist Nadia Saramatakis has argued that sensory histories, habits, and gestures sediment into the lived experiences of human embodiment, and also by a kind of contagion into the objects and artifacts that we sense. She writes, the sensory is not only encapsulated within the body as an internal capacity of power, but is also dispersed out there on the surface of things as the latter's autonomous characteristics. Sensory interiors and exteriors constantly pass into each other in the creation of extrapersonal significance. Saramatakis suggests that cherished foods, for example, become marked not only in our sensorium as linked to particular memories, but also themselves sediment the sentiments that we attach to them. So in the example she uses, the apple of childhood is not just associated with memory, but comes to be believed ontologically to carry the very taste memories that it summons. Wave buoys similarly sediment human purposes, though with the additional property that these buoys are recursively understood as objective sensors. These days, most users, professionals at national meteorological or Coast Guard or oil company jobs, do not read buoy data in coded form, but rather on the internet through displays showing cleaned up information. The homepage of the U.S. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's National Data Buoy Center, in place since 1967, is the key portal through which buoy users can query buoys and obtain statistical information about significant wave heights, periods, and directions. The virtual witnessing offered by a site like this invites moving away from a close reading of an individual buoy to engage in the distant reading that people might now think of in the digital humanities. Some of this is not too difficult. We can discern a national and political economy in the distribution of buoys, and therefore of the waves that are measured, There's very highly measured places and very undermeasured places. The United States National Weather Service is a huge player, making much of its wave data publicly available to fishers, port managers. It's also possible to zoom back in for a close reading. This is the web page of the buoy that is closest to us now, number 44065, which even also has its own web page, so you can see what it looks like. And you can see these spellings out of, like, the waves were 2.3 feet tall earlier this morning. Such an accounting does not provide anything like the biography of a single wave in a way that Mr. Palomar at some moments desired, or which wave scientist Hiyashi Mitsuyasu in his 2009 book, Looking Closely at Ocean Waves from Their Birth to Their Death, seems to deliver, describing waves as having lives that begin and end. Rather, what we get are measurements of significant wave heights. And the word significant in significant wave height is significant. Referring to the mean wave height of the highest third of waves in a time sample, significant wave height originally created to align with heights that might be picked out by a trained observer, and this mostly meant Marines in World War II, remains a measure that is tuned to purposes of human navigation. Well, significant waves to whom? Significant wave height for what? Port design and more. Such significant wave heights can be assembled into a collection of frequencies, what Calvino's Palomar described as, quote, an inventory of all of the wave movements that are repeated with varying frequency within a given time interval. And here, another kind of writing is necessary to read waves, statistical writing. In 1961, the wave power spectrum was introduced to wave science. In this mathematical model, waves are known not as individuals, but as collections of superimposed waves, little and big, with different origins. So a wave of the kind pictured in this photo from 1971, titled The Texture of a Great Wave, a wave might be made up of forces that were churned up by a hurricane a week ago, or as well as by fresh energy from wind-swept ripples just a few moments ago. So waves are rendered not as wavy side views of undulating water, but as collisions of bell curves. Oceanographers come to speak of wave systems, and the sea becomes statistical. Waves, then, are not wild North Sea sirens, horses, dolphins, but populations. That modern object that Foucault taught us lay at the nexus of state power knowledge. So we can see the National Data Buoys Center landing page afresh. Buoys float inside and outside national nautical territories, and their data is unequally accessible to users. So the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, for example, which is the European analog to this organization, makes use of, does not actually make its predictions public, so there is no website like this for the European Center. Or it's a website that's only accessible if you work for a national weather service. In the 1970s, during the oil crisis, many non-OPEC countries sought to prospect for oil in their territorial waters, which led to a rise in buoy orders from companies keen to keep their drilling practices from competitors. So there's a political economy history going back to the energy crisis of the 70s. What kinds of waves are matters of concern, to use Bruno Latour's phrase? As the map makes clear, coastal waves, monitored for their utility as signs of hurricanes, measured to secure coastal infrastructure, keep track of harbors, those sorts of waves are central. So in concluding, Dracula. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, the character of Mina Murray describes a watery sentinel floating just off of a nearby shore. Quote, a buoy with a bell, which swings in bad weather and sends in a mournful sound on the wind. They have a legend here that when a ship is lost, bells are heard out to sea, unquote. Today's wave buoys have as ancestors these buoys, devices that were often outfitted with bells to warn seafarers of danger. The readings these buoys offered were auditory, listening as reading. 19th century European maritime sensory practices operated not like today's machine-mediated operational impressions, but often through sound, making reading a buoy a matter of listening. By the time Calvino is reading waves, the idiom is visual, about scanning. Mr. Palomar's reading is also a shoreside meditation rather than a fearful at-sea terror. Mr. Palomar is at a remove, flagged by the mathematical language he employs. Brian Rotman's suggestion that mathematics as a sign system does not have a speaking subject is important here. The mathematical reader is, quote, never asked to interpret a message which makes reference to the subject's embodied presence, unquote. As I've pointed out, the wave rider is designed to extract formal information from the sea, encountering the sea as a medium whose material qualities need to be taken into account only to then be factored out. In other words, for the buoy to be a medium for wave information, it needs to be abstracted from its ambient surround. The ocean itself as a medium, as scholars such as Ava Hayward and Melody Jew suggest, and these are just a couple of articles by them, Submerging Kittler is a recent one. What is Kittler like underwater? As Ava Hayward and Melody Jew suggest, thinking of seawater as a substance that can carry communication, history, and material memory comes to have a parallel life, becoming background to itself. That formalist approach, the formalist approach concretized by the wave rider, has been leveraged by artist David Bowen in his 2011 installation piece, Telepresent Water, which, quote, draws information from the intensity and movement of the water in a remote location. If this were a little movie, this thing would be kind of like looping up and down. And yeah, there's this. This is, wave data is collected in real time from National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration Data Buoy Station 46246 with the following coordinates. The wave intensity and frequency is scaled and transferred via marionette-like strings to a mechanical grid structure, resulting in a simulation of the physical effects caused by the movement of water from halfway around the world. So the transmission of data from buoy 46246, and I can't quite see this, but I looked up its webpage, so it's there. It's cited off of Hawaii. The transmission of this data from the Pacific to an art gallery underscores this notion that waves can be known through form alone. And that, of course, is a technical and aesthetic simplification. Just as optical character recognition can be confused by blurry documents, handwriting, and more, as Mara Mills has suggested, so too can automatic wave recognition be stymied by the information the buoy's designers fashion as separate from its watery substrate. The political theorist Carl Schmitt, there he is, writing of the sea as a blank slate between nations, once dismissed waves this way, quote, the sea has no character in the original sense of the word, which comes from the Greek charasein, meaning to engrave, to scratch, to imprint. On the waves, there is nothing but waves. This, of course, is a reading, this, of course, is wrong. This, of course, is a reading at odds with the evidence of buoys, crafted precisely to record the tracks of waves on the sea. And going back to Dracula for a moment, and thinking about waves as harbingers as well as specters of human loss, consider Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, which presses readers to remember, quote, the transverse waves of the wake, unquote, of Atlantic slave ships. For Sharp, following Derek Walcott, the sea is history, and waves, particularly ship-made waves, are its deathly haunting inscriptions. Thinking of waves as form alone, or as material alone, apart from their simultaneous force as significant for those who would interpret them, is to miss many ways on beyond Calvino of reading a wave. The strange device of the wave rider that I've discussed here, animated by a mathematical syntax designed with semantics of correspondence, an afterimage of the pragmatics of economies of metals, plastics, liquid, cable, toxins, offers a hypertextual path. Opening the black box of the yellow buoy reveals a hybrid inscription device, an amalgam of human, non-human operational impressions, a message in a vessel that calls for old and new modes of reading and of reading waves.
Okay. Now we have time for a conversation questions from the audience. Also, the panelists may speak with each other. Does, are there any?
We can talk with each other afterwards, so maybe.
Oh, I see, yes.
Yeah.
Varji?
I don't know if it's a question or a comment exactly. Thank you so much. I just recently, to my shame, only recently discovered my solicitor's work. I can't even pronounce it. In San Francisco. And she had this extraordinary sentence in one of the rooms that came up at the end of your talk, which is, images are like scattered bones disconnected from the skeleton narrative. And I understand that, like, mourning, the actual sort of reading of a photographic image, especially of the dead, is an endless process. But I was kind of interested in hearing more about that sentence, this notion of images being like scattered bones, and then the kind of, what I understood from your paper and also from the exhibit that I saw, the kind of forensic images of Mysilis's work, this desire to assemble bones into a skeleton, much like this father is attempting to assemble the bones of his son in order to mourn him, even as I understand the bones are kind of disintegrating. And so, I mean, in a way, there's the forensic process is a process of attempting to make the bones speak.
Right.
In a kind of prosopopea, right? And that seems, I mean, not necessarily intention, but I'm wondering how that links, or how we talk about that particular project of reconstructing the skeleton in an always incomplete attempt at narrative. And I was thinking here about your discussion of narrative as a potential foreclosure, right? And the much more, and the kinds of mutations and metamorphoses that the diptych and the triptych that you analyze so beautifully kind of suggest. And I'm not saying they're contradictory necessarily, I'm just interested in that this, kind of relationship between the testimonial specificity of a forensic approach.
Right.
Right? And the more, I don't know, metamorphic kind of circulation that happens when we're talking about images, depending on other images to come into history.
Right. The passage that you're citing from Susan, or that I cited also, appears in the work that she did in Kurdistan, right?
Right.
I mean, so she's invited by the forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow to travel to Kurdistan with him to document the mass graves. Right? So there are photographs of Clyde Snow with skulls in his hands and so on, but she's documenting different graves in northern Iraq especially. And she makes this identification between the reading of a photograph, the excavation that is required in reading a photograph, because you look at a photograph, in order to read it, you have to reconstruct the context and circumstances in which it was produced, but also pay attention to the force of decontextualization that every photograph enacts, because every photograph rips something else out of a context. So reading a photograph requires both contextualizing and decontextualizing, or at least paying attention to both of those gestures. And when she's talking about the excavation of a grave site or of a mass grave, I think that what she's trying to do in this particular passage, when she identifies the reading of a photograph with the reconstruction of a series of what she calls a kind of skeletal frame, it's the requirement of a narrative to piece the skeleton together, right? I mean, as you suggested too. So. What I was trying to do in reading the diptych was to also read them as ribs, as bones, let's say, in some way, and try and put them together and reconstruct the skeletal narrative. But it's not a skeletal narrative in the sense of just being thin. It requires a kind of, this is very telegraphic, the talk, but it would require a kind of massive reconstruction of the history that is sealed, not only within those photographs, but also within each one of those bodies that are in there. So I think that what she's just trying to do is talk about the way in which the excavation of a gravesite, which requires this labor, is analogized, is identified with the excavation that has to take place when you read a photograph. So even though it looks like a flat surface, it bears an entire network of historical traces within it. Right? So that this is why it's like excavating and reconstructing a body. I don't know if this is, yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much for your presentations. I have a question for Professor
if I'm understanding you properly, you're just saying that in how would one apply sort of the reading of these images in sequence to the reading of a book that also includes both photograph and text?
Yes,
Ah.
and so my point is like how we should like redefine this juxtaposition of this textual narrations and the photographies under your framework of reading photography.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say just two very quick things. I mean, one is, one of the threads, one of the red threads to the presentation is that a photograph is insufficient by itself, right? That it, first of all, it never appears really alone. It always appears in a series. It's always serial. Every photograph is serial, just as we're always serial, right? So every photograph is serial. It never stands on its own. It always requires to be read in relation to other images, in relation to context, circumstances, texts, apparatuses, interviews. You have to put all that material alongside a photograph in order to read it. You can't read it. It doesn't stand alone. Right? So the reading of a photo text would, I imagine that the textual apparatus is there to help illuminate, in some instances, the photographs. But even when that's not the case, those things need to be read syntactically in relation to one another. So that, just as a parenthesis, I'm actually presently team teaching a course with Susan Meiselas entitled Alphabetographies, which is on the relation between text and images, but by looking at collaborations between writers and photographers. So we're looking at a series of photo books. Some of them have text, some of them don't. It depends, but I think that what one does is, in some sense, what I'm suggesting is that in the same way that you would need to read photographs in relation to one another, syntactically in relation to one another, you would have to do that for text and images. You have to read the relationship between the text and the image, and it's not always something that is straightforward. I'll let you call.
Oh.
I also have a question for Professor Cadava. I hope
Okay,
that's
I'm going to
okay.
ask you lots of questions.
Yeah.
I know. No, she has a question.
So, the first photograph with the woman, I read that as sort of a bird-like shape. And then I think because of your reading or because I had where my mind was, it reminded me of Antigone, who, right out in the morning, but who compares herself, I mean, she has a strong relation to birds. And compares herself to the bird. And so, and I understand, or I think what I got from your argument is also this, the analogy between mourning and reading, both as forms of collecting and gathering remains, gathering traces. Now I do wonder whether Antigone gives us a different mode of reading, because her reading, as it were, her gathering is very shoddy, it's very superficial. She just like throws a little bit of sand over the body of a brother in the Sophocles version. But does so at great risk, at great danger. And that seems to be like very different from the kind of very careful, very sort of labor-intensive reading that we usually engage in, and that your artist Susan engages in.
I don't know that I have a direct comment, but I think that the reading of the Susan's images took its point of departure from the Darwish passage, right? Where he's actually talking about the way in which people in the desert will put photographs on the gravesite, and that this becomes a means of training history to read, not training people, training history to read, right? So the activity of reading that he's trying to talk about isn't reducible to humans in this case, right? It's how do you train history to read? What would it mean to train history and not persons to read? And I think this is actually very linked to the mechanisms that are doing the reading in Stefan's talk. I mean, these are not humans doing the reading, although they require humans to read the data and so on. But so I think that in terms of the link between the reading and the activity of mourning and so on, this is an old, easy gig in the photographic context, right? The moment you have a photograph in your hand, that's the best evidence that what you have in your hand is not what was photographed, right? So the photograph exists in relation to the absence of what was photographed, which is why the photographs are always talked about in relation to the experience of mourning, right? I don't know if I want to improvise on Antigone. I mean, my reading of Antigone is very mediated by the modern Greek poet Yannis Ritsos' reading of Antigone, which comes through his soliloquy he does through Ismene, Antigone's sister. And in that reading, it's a criticism of Antigone's activities of mourning. But this is something maybe we should talk about in another context.
Thanks. I have comments and questions for Stefan. Thank you so much for that talk. One is a super pragmatic question that I have about a lot of big data and data collection, which is that, you know, we're supposed to sort of accept all of this collecting of data because it's for something, and in the case of waves, it's usually the idea is it will predict a tsunami and save people, though it never seems to do that, and I'm just wondering why the tsunamis always seem to come as a massive surprise when there are all these buoys and the buoys in the water everywhere. Like, you know, in Indonesia just a month ago, there was a tsunami. So with all of these tracking devices, why don't we have any power prediction there? So that's one sort of really pragmatic question. But the second is a reference for you when you get tired of the Calvino. Here's another one. I don't know if you're a Kate Bush fan.
Oh, yeah.
You know Kate Bush. Well, so, you know, the second side of the cloud busting album is called The Ninth Wave.
Yes,
Yes,
right.
and it's kind of brilliant in terms of your topic because she imagines herself as a buoy in the water. We don't know why this person has ended up in the water, but she's lost, and she has a series of meditations on the water and on earth. And in English, in England, they say not buoy but boy, and so there's also a sort of gender confusion that's interesting because she's like, if people see me, I wonder if they'll take me for a boy. So I think there's a lot there. The inscription on the album cover is from Tennyson's Idyll of the Kings, in which Arthur is delivered to the nation on the ninth wave.
Yes.
And the ninth wave, of course, is supposed to be an enormous wave within a series. So, you know, how about Kate Bush?
Yes, I love Kate Bush, and I know that album, but I haven't figured out how to. Thank you. In response to the first question about big data and prediction, I mean, most of the tsunami prediction is meant to be done by seismometers that are at the bottom of the sea rather than the buoys. Buoys. But that said, there could be information gatherable from the buoys to detect when a tsunami is happening. But that becomes this question of tuning. What kinds of wavelengths is the thing tuned to be, you know, paying attention to? And that's about what kind of significance is significant. What kind of information is the information that makes a difference to whom? And then the question of who the paymasters are of the buoys and who's asking and why becomes really central. Who uses this data? It's not neutral, right? It's military. It's about container ships. It's about it is about sort of meteorology and weather, but that's also a very heterogeneous crowd of people. I mean, there are hedge fund people who try to get data about where storms are so they can like figure out, is the ship going to land on time in Hong Kong, and can I long or short this thing so that I can make money, right? So there's all these really interesting practices of reading that can be put on top of it, so.
Is it possible, though, that the ocean and the wave, and you sort of suggested this in the concept of the wave as a population or entities, that they're not measurable? You can't, like, so how would you know if this was a particularly big wave coming in? You don't know till it arrives. Is that possible? Which would be sort of amazing, but something.
Right. There's sort of the temporality of prediction and the temporality of action. I mean, the tsunami that happened in 2004 in the Indian Ocean there's lots and lots of time anxiety about how fast the detections happened and how quickly the information was relayed. and lots of comparisons to trains and airplanes and all of this sort of worry about the temporality of the infrastructure and trying to speed it up. And there's a political economy of, who has which infrastructure where and why did it take so long to get from Honolulu to the Andaman Islands. Right? And that, anyway.
A question for Stefan. I'm wondering, is it an inappropriate question to ask whether or not the history was really not about waves, but rather about, let's say, a process of abstraction, and in fact, the kind of abstraction that we then mistakenly take for the actual life, shall we say, of the sea. For example, I noticed, which seemed almost a deliberate exiling of those who have the greatest knowledge of the sea. For example, surfers, Polynesian instrumentalist navigators, or even the Bascom work, for example, the marine biologists who understand the way, everything from energy to pattern are imprinted, create an environment for the growth and shaping of the organisms that live in that particular littoral just near the edge of the where it contacts land. There is an entire, shall we say, pragmatic knowledge, a profound knowledge of the sea, a mastery of the sea, not to mention the recent discovery of the mammalian dive reflex, for example, which places human nervous system, actually, it has some kind of inexplicable adaptation for, exactly for surviving and adapting to enormously great pressures of being underwater, such that the capacity for managing gases in their bloodstream are extraordinary, can be managed for up till 16, 17 minutes by actual humans, which is really to say that there is a life of the sea, and there's, to talk about kinship, etc. I don't want to go there. What I really want to say is that is there a curiosity in a historian about the sea qua sea, or rather, I'm sorry, the waves qua waves, and why, for example, do the other knowledges, for example, make no appearance here, when in fact they really have a lot to do with the topos, shall we say, conference. I'm just wondering, is that what is historiography? What is it? What is its goal? In a sense, did you not find out the exact thing you knew at the beginning? In fact, was the what do you? Yeah, let me hear what you were.
Well, I think you're right. I could have written lots of different papers about different things and entities and agents reading waves, including surfers. One thing I would say about the surfer story is that there is, of course, a long Hawaiian and Polynesian history that can be leveraged there, about which people have been writing really interesting kind of post-colonial theory about who occupies the waves, who owns them, what are the racial politics of who gets to ride what kinds of things. But with respect to sort of the history of surfing, for example, so much of it, maybe because I'm an anthropologist and I think about Marcel Mauss sometimes, so much of it is about the techniques of the body and techniques of embodiment and meeting waves, which are all about class and race and gender and bodily comportments, right? And also when you talk about surfing, the history of the materials that are being used to generate surfboards are also connected to sort of longer military and colonial histories, neoprene, the foam that's in surfboards. If you think about these things are sort of this very, very entangled story. So Willard Bascom, the guy with the ruler, is kind of this interesting switching point between military and surfing history, where a lot of what's going on off the coast of California in the 40s and 50s and 60s is the simultaneous making of militarized wave knowledge and recreational surf knowledge, with these kind of affects about the sea also coming into being together. So certain kinds of laid-back white surfer masculinity coming into being at the same time as a kind of, just back from the Vietnam War kind of military story, right? I mean, there's that amazing scene in Apocalypse Now, right, of the surfing. The surfing story is also one that connects up to, in other words, connects up to these infrastructural stories that I think, one of the surfing, one of the fantasies, I think, of the surfing world is that there is some kind of intuitive, direct connection with waves, when in fact that's a production of long histories of the invention of swimming lessons, coastal vacations, segregation at beaches. Like all of those things go into. There's a wonderful book called Psychedelic White by Arun Saldana, which is about the racial politics of surfing off of the coast of Goa, and about and thinks about race and water as the kind of viscous substances that make, particular places and particular waves and particular bodies work together. So yes, there are many different kinds of surfing knowledges, and there's another story to be told about Polynesian wayfinding, of course, which is, yeah. So yes, there are many, many different kind of reading practices that that can be asked after, and I sort of completely left out satellites. That's another story, the story of satellites doing stuff. And a lot of the satellites that measure waves are geocentric rather than geosynchronous, which means that they kind of are absent for large swaths of time and only do sort of snapshot stuff, which is why buoys sort of still exist. Because one question is like, well, why do these things still exist when there's satellites? It's, well, there's different kinds of satellites. And some of them, and the ones that are generally trained on waves don't actually have the kind of presence in any individual given moment that a buoy does.
By the way, in the way of a tip, like the Kate Bush, the Economist magazine, in case you missed it, did a beautiful long series on the ocean and all the massive infrastructure of sensing that's being put into place and the integration of it. It's an amazing story. That made it look like what you prepared.
Yeah, cool.
I think we have time for a few more, maybe 2 more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, just really briefly, Eduardo, I mean, this is more of a comment or story, but I once saw Susan speaking at an exhibition with Aurora in the day, and one of the images she showed of a student, the young woman being disappeared, and at the end, very, very end of the event, after being quite academic conversation, a woman in the audience spoke up and said that being her sister, and then she always wanted to meet Susan. I guess that really, yeah, it resonated a lot with many of the things that you were saying about the idea of trace and how it can be operationalized, but it also sort of made me think in a way I haven't really come across, I guess, about the actual biography of the photographer in that, and how much responsibility she must bear, and I wonder how that impacts on how she does assemble these images. And with regards to Stefan, I just wondered, it seems like a lot of the systems that are built into the Buoys, the different elements, really, amazingly sort of detailed. But it's almost like each dimension of the buoy is an exclusion, right? So the system produces its environment by what it excludes from the environment. And that's what it's assembling, right? These multiple differences, these differentiations are entirely like excluding the environment in order to do that, and then assembling the network in a website or operational and I just wondered, like, is that kind of like incompetent reading? In other words, like kind of like precluding reading? It's just that like you cannot read these videos. These are actually this is entirely prescribed. Everything's operationally excluded. So any sort of literary or other sort of way of understanding the ocean is excluded in advance. It seems like what you do, I think is Provost Karasielski, sort of bring reading back into that.
Oh, no, there was a comment.
Can you ask that again? Or just,
I mean, I don't know, I can't help but I sort of have a bit of a systems theory thing in my head all the time. Just seems that like exclude, it's like
yes, I
making
mean,
the environment is
right.
impossible by exclusion.
right. I mean, that's part of why I depended on Daston and Gallison's notion of mechanical objectivity, right? The kind of production of a kind of practice of making legible that necessarily excludes and necessarily puts things out of the discipline of attention. I don't know if I have much more to say about that, except that I think you're right, that it is about, I mean, these constant Cartesian cuts, to go back to to that term, right? This constant inclusion, exclusion. You can read this, but you can't read that, right? And the buoys themselves are these kind of weird accretions of the aspiration to do new kinds of reading. Can we add another sensor that does this? So it's this kind of accretive fantasy that other things could be included, right? So I think the imagination of the people building it is not that they are sort of willfully trying to exclude in some ontological sense, right? But that they would be open to including everything if only they could in some big data fantasy.
Just as a follow-up, maybe, Stefan, on Sanford's question in terms of, I think that what you've done is not reading the waves, you've actually taken the buoy as your vehicle.
Yeah.
That I think is a fascinating thing, is you're undulating with the buoy as the buoy is taking you different places.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that it very powerfully opens up is it changes the narratives of paradigm in terms of how we're used to thinking about. So this was the wave ontology at that specific historical moment. You start with the myths and you say that now we have the spectral analysis.
Right.
And then suddenly the spectral analysis and the mathematics explodes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, because I was trying to enumerate the readings and I gave up at a certain moment. I find it very exciting, in fact, as you're workshopping this thing. So
Mhm.
you've actually taken this, and here's a case study of how this is working.
Mhm.
What do you conclude?
What am I
At this
con-
point, with the explosion of narrativity and reading.
with respect to this particular kind of
This
device?
particular device
Or-
in specific context, because the context you've been looking at for a while, this specific device is not always your vehicle.
No, right. I mean, I guess that's why I'm thinking about this multiplicity of readings, that the Marxist reading does a lot of things for me, but not everything, you know, and the sort of media ecology reading permits I guess, putting on the different glasses of the different, to take Jane's idiom, putting on the glasses of the different stuff for different kinds of reading glasses affords a different set of interpretations, which, I don't know, this doesn't answer your question at all.
No,
I
because
was-
you could keep writing, I guess. If you would have more time, you would.
I would just keep going. I mean, there's, yes.
Because the media ecology keeps shifting and expanding and it's more.
But I do keep going back to what the scientists and engineers think they're doing. I mean, maybe that's the anthropological answer, right? I could go everywhere, sort of interpretively, but trying to stay close to the community that I'm writing about, which are engineers and oceanographers who want to sort of have some kind of apprehension of this object, what they take to be this object, which has changed as an object over the last 100 years, right? That waves understood as spectral entities is a really interesting and strange new way to think. It turns the ocean into a giant radio, right? That this is borrowed from radio science, and then so suddenly the ocean becomes, and that becomes the nature of it, right? And it has always already been the nature of the sea to be spectral.
But just to push this a little bit further, I mean, if you revert back to the sociology, which is anthropology, but if you take it more seriously, when you say that the sociological can expand also out, we're talking about the studio, is that a possibility, do you think, within these classes of the anthropological?
Yes.
Then I'm optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, it was going back to
No, but I also think what's
Eduardo-
interesting is the way in which I mean, it's true that he's doing this, but he's also framing, touching, punctuating what he's doing by references to Calvino, Walcott, Wolfe, and Stoker. This makes it extremely interesting, but in terms of not just scientific, but also literary, and there's a world that he's trying to create that literature plays a role in that.
That's for sure, but I think those punctures we have examples for. I think where we're going off the deep end into
Yeah.
the sociology of minerals,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
another
Mm.
pond
Yeah,
that
yeah.
has not been dipped into yet.
Yeah, but I wonder if the literature there still provides a kind of resource that enables one to then touch the new things. I don't know.
Mhm, mhm.
Taking your example, because I had to think of the insistence on the photograph just to get more into the discursive limits, I think. At some point you say that the trace in itself is nothing. And I disagree.
Meaning
with that.
not a single thing.
Not a single thing.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, not a single thing. Because that's something that I could try in fact, I say that in a world where everything can become something else or linked to everything else, and nothing is ever just itself.
there is the photographic plate analogy and stuff, the research that Jonathan Prairie was doing with regards to Cézanne's work.
Right.
He was imagining himself as a sensitized place. In fact, there's a photographic analogy that's translated to a kind of direct apprehension of the landscape.
Right.
And I would also have to think of the juxtaposition in terms of the, not only the archaic project of Benjamin, but if you take the juxtaposition in Abbey Warburg. So that,
Of course, of course.
but Abbey Warburg is talking about images. What's the insistence on the trace and the photographing? Because I think that's a discursively organized logic.
Of what, of the Warburg or the,
The historiography of photographs that we have in terms of being attuned, the death, those are very...
that's a very old, that's why I said it's a very sort of easy gig within the context of the history of the discourse on photography to link photography with.
But even the narrative of the tragedy that we were exposing is based on a very linear notion of time that also has at its center loss, which is primarily...
I don't know, I was actually specifically going against the linear conception of time in terms of the before and after with the diptych, right? You have the image, the first image of the sister, then, I mean, it's a sister, it's family member's sister, then the cross, but that cross, even though it's taken after, references something that's before. So that before, well, I mean, it's not linear from before to after. It's a before that is both after and before at the same time. It's not a line, is what I'm saying.
If you take the image as a trace of an actual optics of interactions of chemicals, then it is a trace that persists. That's what I'm getting at. So I think that there are other ontologies of image that potentially get into a different kind of linearity of time. And the question that I think overlaps with the two of them is the question of the discursive limits of what we think we're puncturing and how we're getting beyond.
Right.
We have run out of time.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so
Thank you very
much, both of you.